welcome to this event. Uh, I'm delighted to be part of this discussion in honor of a magisterial, intellectually rich volume on historiographical traditions of early North India. The author, Professor Romila Thapar, needs no introduction to any of you. She is among the most eminent historians who have worked on ancient India. And after a lifetime work on, justly praised work on ancient Indian history, in this volume, Professor Thapar turns towards a different kind of history. It's a history of history writing, you could say. And in doing this, Professor Thapar is also, in some sense, contesting a kind of prejudice which was very much there in the late 18th and 19th centuries during the colonial period among colonial historians that India lacked a history in ancient times. There was no historical sense. Professor Thapar's interest is not just in disputing that claim and showing that there was a sense of history in ancient India, but also to understand what history meant for our predecessors, people who lived in ancient India. What was the past for them? What kind of forms did it take? Did they all have historicity in the same degree? What are the different kinds of ways in which these writers at different points in time negotiated questions of history? These are some of the issues Professor Thapar raises in the book. And today we have three eminent historians to discuss the book. I shall briefly introduce them, and after that I shall invite Professor Thapar to make some preliminary remarks, and then we will move on to the panel discussion. Our first panelist is going to be Professor Kumkum Roy, who is a professor at the Center for Historical Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Roy has been teaching in the center since 1999. Her doctoral work was on the emergence of monarchy in North India, mid-first millennium BCE. This was based on a study of later and post-Vedic textual sources, which were analyzed to explore the complex connections between the emergence of political institutions and domestic relations. She has also been keenly interested in the teaching of history in schools, developing curricula and textbooks in collaboration with the Delhi SCERT and the national body, that's the NCERT. One of her main areas of interest is in engendering studies of early Indian social history in particular, and gender studies, women's studies in general. Her current research interests include exploring questions of intertextuality in early and early medieval Sanskrit texts, with a special focus on representations of gender, marginalized peoples, and liminal spaces. After Professor Roy, we will turn to Professor Kesavan Veluthat, who is currently a professor in the Department of History of Delhi University. Professor Veluthat has taught in different government colleges in Kerala between 1975 and 1982. He joined the newly formed Mangalore University in 1982, and then he took retirement as professor from there and chair of the department in 2008, and joined the University of Delhi the year after that. He was a visiting professor at various institutions, including École Pratique de Haute Étude Paris, Maison des Sciences de l'Homme Paris, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam. And our last panelist is Dr. Najaf Haider, who is an associate professor at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU. He is a member of the editorial board of studies in history. He's a member of the executive committee of the Indian History Congress, visiting fellow of SOAS, London, visiting fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and overseas, he has had several awards and honors to his credit, and he's a specialist on medieval history of Islam, medieval literary cultures, and economic history of medieval India. So I welcome all the panelists and Professor Thapar to this discussion, and now may I request Professor Thapar to make some preliminary remarks.
Thank you, Uday. I suppose I should begin by telling you in one sentence what the book is about. The book is about historical consciousness, historical traditions, and historical writing in early India. And I am making a distinction between the three. Historical consciousness need not be expressed in writing, but may be expressed in writing. Historical writing, of course, has to be in writing, and historical traditions are a kind of bridge between the two. The subject is, in a sense, almost part of my autobiography, because it's lived with me for about 40 years. It's become a part of my life and goes back a long way. The germ of the idea really started off in a conference that took place at the School of Oriental and African Studies, long before most of you were born, in 1956. And the conference was on historians of India, Pakistan, and Ceylon. And it was an attempt to try and look at this question of what is historical writing, when does it begin, and how is it expressed. Nevertheless, the assumption in this conference was that the study of what we call historiography, the history of historical writing, began with British writing on Indian history, because the Indians did not write history. They did not have a sense of history. This was based largely on the notion that you do not have in the Indian tradition writers like Herodotus and Thucydides and Tacitus, or like the Chinese analyst Sima Qian. And therefore, it was assumed that there was an absence. Historical writing was defined by the ideas of a rational explanation of the past. Although, of course, these days there's a very interesting discussion going on about the degree to which even writers such as Herodotus, for example, are providing rational interpretations or not. So there is a reconsideration of historical writing on a large scale. And the reason why the chronicles of the Sultanate were excluded from this tradition of Indian historical thinking was largely because they said they followed a tradition of Islamic historiography, and this was supposedly not Indian. So we're left with texts coming from the beginning, going from the beginning up to about 1300 AD, 1400 AD. Texts largely written in Sanskrit and Prakrit, which may or may not conform to ideas of historical writing. My initial interest then began because I was a student at that time and sat on the sidelines and listened to this conference, and was very puzzled by the statements that were made, like, for example, the great Professor R.C. Majumdar, who said, we had historical literature, but we had no historical writing. And so my question in my mind was that surely if we had historical literature, there must have been some idea of history. Nevertheless, these kinds of generalizations were made. And I came back thinking I would like to work on historiography at some point, but wasn't really encouraged very much by senior Indian historians who kept saying to me, बेटी अगर तुमने रिसर्च करना है तो किसी ढंग के सब्जेक्ट पे रिसर्च करो, ये हिस्टोरियोग्राफी क्या चीज़ होती है, ये तो फजूल है. So I left it at that for the moment. But nevertheless, events overtook this idea. Remember that I'm talking about the 1960s and 70s, which are a very crucial period in the study of ancient India. There's a shift, a series of shifts taking place at this time. two of which I would like to refer to a little bit. One was that it moved ancient history, the study of ancient history moved, not only in India, but generally, but in the case of India, it moved from Indology to what we began to call the social sciences or the human sciences. What did this mean? For example, amongst French Indologists, and by Indologists here what is meant is essentially people who read Sanskrit and Prakrit and were interested in traditional Indian culture, civilization, history, and so on. For example, amongst the French in the Arnalds school, there was an attempt to apply the generalizations, or at least to question the Sanskrit texts by asking questions that arose out of the generalizations that were made in social anthropology, sociology, questions of philosophy, the sociology of religion, and so on. To give you an example, there was this magnificent book by Marcel Mauss called The Gift, where he does precisely that. So there is a kind of new direction that is coming into the study of ancient history and ancient studies. Classical cultures generally at this time are beginning to be seen from a new perspective. It's partly a comparative perspective, and this becomes very clear if you look at a journal that got started at around this time and continued later on, called History and Theory, in which this comparative perspective on classical cultures is very important. It was also influenced by people looking at the theories of explanation, the grand theory that became characteristic of 19th century European thinking. And people, for example, who'd worked on some Indian material like Karl Marx and Max Weber, produced theories of explaining Indian society and Chinese society and so on in terms of a kind of universal application to non-European societies. The famous case being, of course, the Asiatic mode of production, which was applied not only to Asia but to Latin America as well. The interest then shifted, at least my interest shifted, from asking this question of why is it always said that Indians didn't have a sense of history, to realizing that all societies record their past in a particular form, and what is of interest to the historian is to try and investigate what these forms are and why the past is recorded in a particular way. The relevant question then was no longer why does India not have a sense of history, but what is in fact the sense of history that is recorded in Indian texts. And the kinds of questions that we started asking then were, what were the forms in which the past was represented in early India? Why did the forms change over time and move, for example, from genealogies to narratives, which is a very major shift that takes place? To what degree was there a consciousness of these being historical and a testing of the historicity of the text? Did it actually, what it refers to, did these events and people actually happen and exist? What was the agenda and purpose of the text, and how were they used apart from being records from the past? And if societies have many pasts, as we began arguing then, that there is not a single past, but there are multiple pasts, if societies have many pasts, then why is it that generally one of them is chosen as the primary representation of the past of that society? And who does this choosing, which is, of course, an important question. The questions also kept evolving and changing as one went on with the study. And this required a kind of teasing out of the ideas of history from texts and sifting those texts that one thought had a little more history than was normally required. And of course, analyzing quite rigorously the crafting and the creation of these texts and the narratives that they contained. And this then really is, to summarize very briefly, the background from which I started looking at these texts and writing this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. Now we will move on to Kumkum.
Thank you. I would like to begin by saying that reading this book, The Past Before Us, Historical Traditions of Early North India, is an extremely daunting task. It's not something that is easy, and it's not simply because it's long. The book runs into several hundred pages, but also because the book makes demands on the reader. It's not something that would flow very automatically and smoothly. You have to think as you read, and then you find that there is more to think about. So it is a daunting book, but nonetheless, it's something that is extremely well worth the effort of reading it. And I've had the opportunity of reading it twice over the last couple of months, and I can see that I will be reading it many more times in the years to come. As Romila herself has pointed out, the book has had a long history. And I remember while I was reading the book, it struck me that there are parts of this that I'd heard in class in the 1970s. And now, as she has pointed out, it went back 20 years before that as well. So obviously, this is a book which has really taken a long time to come before us. It covers an extremely vast canvas, as Romila has just laid it out before us. And because of that, it's extremely rich. The book itself is divided into 6 parts, and we've had a little informal discussion amongst the panelists, and what we decided is that we would partition out the book amongst us, parcel it out amongst us. So I will be focusing on the second and third parts of the book, which are titled The Embedded Tradition and The Emerging Tradition. So this springs from what Romila has just mentioned about the different ways in which historical consciousness is articulated and the forms historical writing takes in different contexts. The first thing I'd like to point out is that even in these 2 sections, we can see that what Romila is engaging with is a vast range of very diverse genres of texts. So you begin the book with looking at early Vedic literature, which is ritual literature of a very distinctive kind, and which demands certain kinds of specialized readings. Then there is a shift to the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the Sanskrit epics basically. But what's interesting over there is that Romila poses different sets of questions for the Mahabharata and a different set of issues for the Ramayana. So it's not as if they are treated identically in spite of them being clubbed together as epics in our everyday perceptions. Then she moves on to the Puranas and the genealogical sections within them. And the last essay that I'll be discussing is where she looks at courtly literature, more specifically the plays of Vishakadatta. So you have that entire range of texts, very, very different from one another, being explored in just these 2 parts, and there are more in the subsequent parts to come. Now, consequently, what happens is when you are reading this set of essays, while there is this discussion on historical consciousness, historical tradition, historical writing going on, you can also see that what is emerging is a history of Sanskrit literature. And it's a very different history of Sanskrit literature from what we are usually accustomed to read. And in that sense, you can see that this is a kind of subtext running through, which makes it absolutely fascinating. So you can read the book, and I'm sure there's much more to it than what I will be summarizing and discussing now, but you can see that there are different levels and different registers using which one can approach the book. Now, Romila lays down a set of 7 questions at the outset of the book, and these I think are extremely significant because they help us in navigating the book, reading the book, understanding what are the issues she's raising, and these set of questions then become markers that we can follow through the book. one of these, and this is the first one with which she starts, is discussing at what point of time is it necessary to create and preserve a tradition. So there's nothing automatic or natural about these traditions emerging. They emerge within a particular historical context. So this then compels us to engage with the question of what is this historical context and why is it that recording the past becomes important at certain points of time, or evoking the past becomes important. The second question that she raises is that about the social status of those who keep the tradition. And this again is a question that she explores at length in very, very interesting ways. I'll come back to this when I talk a little bit more about the Vedic material, where all of us have this notion that the Vedas are composed by seers and so on. We've all grown up with that. But she disaggregates the seers, she classifies them in different ways, and then you can see that what one would sometimes simplistically look at as the Vedic tradition as being a kind of Brahmanical tradition, but that it has several diverse strands that go into its making. And this is just one example of the richness of this text. The third issue, and this comes up in different ways at different points in the book, is how is historical writing or the historical tradition connected with sacred literature? And here again, Romila comes up with different answers at different points in the book. It's not as if there's a uniform formulaic answer, but you can see different responses coming up from different traditions. When she's looking at the Vedic tradition, there is one kind of response, there's a different one from the Buddhist and Jaina traditions, and so on. It's again a fascinating strand to follow through. Then, of course, she raises the issue of what are the genres in which historical traditions are preserved. That's, again, a running theme. Then, the social context within which historical consciousness or historical traditions become meaningful. And then, the question of the audience of these texts. So that, again, is something that very often historians of ancient India have taken for granted or ignored, but this is something that confronts us time and again as we read the book. And lastly, the social groups who actually make use of the past. So this is a kind of set of initial questions that are posed, and we can follow them through the chapters and through the book. As Romila has just mentioned, she uses these categories of historical consciousness, historical tradition, and historical writing, belief in the past, using the past in creating new literary genres. But what's interesting about the book, and what also makes it challenging to read it, is that these are not visualized as watertight compartments, but rather they are viewed as intersecting categories, and these intersections then lend dynamism to the way in which the historical consciousness and historical tradition is visualized. So it then takes us to this whole issue of history being something that involves selecting, arranging, recording, and the context within which this tradition develops. So throughout then, we have this constant dialogue between the past and the present, but it's not the past and the present in the sense of only the 21st century vis-a-vis, say, the mid-first millennium or the mid-second millennium BC, but also the pasts and the presents within those pasts. So you can have the Gupta period reflecting on the Maurya period. You can see the way in which the Vedic tradition develops and the pasts within that and how it works out. You can see how the Puranas look at the Vedas and so on. There are several distinct strands that one can see in all of this. So what emerges then is that there are several parallel conversations that are traced, and sometimes you can see the conflicts amongst these conversations. And one of the interesting and significant elements of this book is that it alerts us to the fact that the Brahmanical and Buddhist traditions, for example, are in constant dialogue with one another. So we can't view these as, again, watertight compartments, but you can see the interaction amongst them and the interplay in different ways, which again is a very interesting strategy and which enriches this volume enormously. Now, turning to the way in which the Vedic literature and the subsequent traditions are treated, one of the strategies that we can see in this book is that issues of historicity are treated as not being central. So whether a particular battle took place or not, whether an event described in the Vedas or in the epics or in the Puranas actually occurred or not, which has very often been a trap into which historians of ancient India have fallen, this is actually avoided. So this is something that I think throughout there's an attempt to steer clear of these very consciously. So what happens then is we are led to consider what are the situations in which, and how do we understand the political structures or the societies that produced memories of these kinds of events or produced representations of these kinds of events, and why do we have these distinctive ways of remembering the past? So constantly we are reminded that the questions which are being posed and which are being addressed are not ones of whether something actually happened or did not happen, but why is something remembered in a certain way, and why is something being treated as part of this past. And then there are also constant reminders about how these pasts were used. For example, and this is one of the many instances that we find in the text, you have the Dana Stutis in the Rig Veda, literally praises to honor the generous patron, often the chief of the clan, and these were supposed to be composed by the Vedic poets. Now, all of these work with a logic of evoking memories of past generosity in order to provoke generosity in future, and sometimes it's a kind of competitive generosity that is being provoked in either the present or the future. So you have that kind of a reading being provided at a number of points, and that then allows us to engage with these issues in a very different way from deciding about whether this chief actually lived and whether he actually offered so many cattle to so-and-so priest or not. It's a different level of discussion in which the text persuades us that we need to engage. Now, coming back very briefly to the kind of discussion that we have on the Vedic seers, these are disaggregated into, say, the Kanvas, the Bhrigus, the Angirasas. Then you have a discussion on the non-Brahmanical seers or the non-Brahmanical composers of historical traditions, including the Sutas and the Magadhas, who may have been bards, and the Vratyas, which is again a very ambivalent category, so that as we read, the monolithic character of authorship very often attributed to these kinds of historical tradition breaks down. We can see that these historical traditions actually emerge from a whole variety of different engagements. And this happens also in the discussion on the Mahabharata, where again we have the very, very ambivalent character of Vyasa, obviously, but we also have the Sutas, that is the bards coming in a different in different modes, and then you have the Bhrigus who Brahmanize the text and who also Vaishnavize the text. So you have a whole range of analyses of the authorship of the text that takes place. Now, in the context of the Mahabharata, one of the issues that Romila raises is the way in which time is conceptualized in this text. And this again is a fascinating discussion. Because on the one hand, there is a notion of cosmic time embedded in the text, which suggests that one world is coming to an end, one yuga is ending and another is taking over, which is part of the cycle of the yugas. At the same time, there is also an understanding that this is an enormous crisis for certain kinds of social and political institutions, where the older institutions, whether we understand these in terms of lineage, collapse and give way to new ideas about kingship. So you have that being juxtaposed. And then you have also within the text the vamshas or the genealogies which have a linear structure. So the same text then incorporates 2 or 3 different notions of time, and how this is done and why is again a very fascinating issue and something that Romila's text opens up for us. Now, when we turn to the Ramayana, we find Romila doing something very different. So in the Mahabharata, there's a very intense engagement with the Sanskrit text, attributed to Vyasa, whereas in the case of the Ramayana, we find it's a different set of strategies that is being used, where we have 3 tellings of the Ramayana being juxtaposed. And it, interestingly enough, starts with the Pali Dasharatha Jataka, then moves on to the Valmiki Ramayana, and then to the Jain Paumacharyam. So you have these 3 different tellings being juxtaposed. And this then allows us to engage with the issue of how something that at one level seems to be the same is engaged with in different ways within these 3 different traditions, and why is it remembered differently? So it opens up a different set of issues, as it were. Turning briefly to the Puranic genealogies, we find that over there what Romila is doing is she's tracing the lineages and how the traditions of remembering genealogies may have developed, why they become critical at certain historical moments. And there is once again an argument being advanced that these are used to consolidate certain ideas about kingship, also to disseminate certain ideas about the past. Again, in terms of authorship, there is the question of priestly control. And again, there is the possibility of dialogue with Buddhism. And somewhat later, again in the same section, but in a different in a different essay, she raises this issue of chronology as we find it in inscriptions, where on the one hand you have the Ashokan inscriptions and others that are dated in regnal years, and then again you have others that are dated in a whole series of eras that were obviously conceptualized and used, including the Vikram era, the Shaka era, the Kalachuri Cheri era, and the Gupta era. Now, what's interesting then is that this brings us back to the nitty-gritty of chronology and the fact that you have these 4 or 5 major dating systems that were prevalent almost simultaneously gives us then a sense of the variety of ways of reckoning the past that were available. So there is that we can see happening. There's also a fascinating description and discussion around the Ashokan pillar in Allahabad, where, as we know, you have the Prayag Prashasti of Samudragupta on the same pillar. And the implications of that. Are there memories of the Mauryas that are being appropriated? Is there a possibility of 2 different notions of kingship being juxtaposed? Is there something about a Buddhist notion of kingship and a Brahmanical notion of kingship? Are there different notions of conquest? So these possibilities then of remembering and using the past is something that are brought up in that context. And again, this idea resurfaces in the essay on the Mudra Rakshasa, basically, which is the major text that, though the other text attributed to Vishakha, that the Devi Chandraguptam is also dealt with, where the question of the connections and the memories between the Guptas and the Mauryas is again something that is there. So why is Pataliputra important? Why is Chandragupta important? All of these then become issues that are opened up for exploration. So the way in which the Guptas remembered the Mauryas and the kind of use of that kind of memory, again within the context of a certain kind of state formation, is something that is brought out in very interesting ways. Now, one thing that struck me and which I think is a possibility that is inherent in the volume, which is touched on in some areas, but which can certainly be carried forward in very stimulating ways, is to try and look at the visual material that we have for this entire period, and to see how memories of the past are reconstituted through this. This comes up in the discussion on the Ashokan pillar, but we also know that, for instance, the Junagadh rock edict, where you have the Mauryan inscription, then you have Rudradaman's inscription, and then you have Skandagupta's inscription. Again, what is the sense of the past that is being evoked by using the same surface time and again? What kinds of memories attached to that? Romila touches on, in certain instances, on royal representations, on coinage, also on the ways in which the dead are memorialized in relic caskets, stupas, megaliths, etc., and the memorial stones. Now, here is where I think there is scope for, again, revisiting these and perhaps opening these up to, again, the kind of very rich analysis that we have for the textual material, because the visual material culture, and again looking at it with the set of 7 questions that Romila poses at the beginning, can really yield us many more insights. So thank you, Romila, for an extraordinary book, and I feel really privileged to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumkum. Now we'll move on to Professor Kesavan Veluthat.
Thank you, sir. I must begin by thanking the India International Center, particularly Dr. Majumdar, for this privilege that I am given. To begin with, I believe that I should start by trying to dispel a possible misunderstanding about this book, as it is about how pre-modern Indian civilization looked at its past. It may be taken as primarily a denial of the 2 centuries of sneer that, I quote, India has produced no Herodotus or Thucydides, unquote, a quotation with which every third-rate textbook of Indian history begins. To be sure, Professor Thapar goes in detail into the lineages of this statement, but it is not as if she is apologetically holding a brief for Indian civilization for this failure, nor attempting to show, tenuously or otherwise, that India too had a tradition of what are read as historical. What she does is to read the texts which express a historical consciousness and delineate patterns of such expressions. No society is devoid of a sense of a past. When a society remembers events or individuals considered as important to it, that is historical consciousness. There is an awareness here of the distinction between mythology and history, between a fantasized past and one that is believed to have really happened, one that is in the realm of the possible. When this consciousness is expressed in a chronological order and in a form which meets the needs of that society, this can be a historical tradition. Where the representation of the past is more consciously constructed with the purpose of such construction not far to seek. When such representations also make a claim to historicity, then it is close to historical writing. Elements of causality appear at various levels. What Professor Thapar does in this book is thus to see how the Indian past looked at its own past. In doing so, she makes a nuanced distinction among these 3, namely a sense of history or historical consciousness, historical tradition, and historical writing. She looks at various texts from the Indian past representing the past variously. She makes it clear at the very outset that every society has many pasts, especially so where multiple social and cultural segments constitute that society. In the context of northern India, she looks broadly at 2 major phases of her history: A, that in which power was exercised by clans, and B, that which had graduated to state societies of various descriptions, especially monarchies. The former expressed its sense of history in an embedded form, and we have to price out the information, as it were, from the veins embedded deeply to see the historical consciousness there. In the case of the latter, history is more externalized. While the embedded forms suited the needs of a clan-based society, the externalized forms were more useful to state-level polities. Professor Kumkum Roy has brilliantly introduced the general concern of the book and spoken on the section on embedded history that Professor Thapar has dealt with at great length. I shall therefore look at the latter, concerned with the externalized forms. The externalized forms expressing a historical consciousness start showing up roughly with the post-Gupta period, what is designated by historians as the early medieval period in Indian history. These new forms included eulogies forming part of inscriptions, historical biographies, and dynastic chronicles. None of these was a new invention, not a sudden emergence. There is no disjuncture from the earlier forms. It is a kind of mutation that we see there. The sections dealing with the origin and early heroes of the Prashasti inscriptions owes much to the Vamshanucharitas in the Puranas, and the sections on the individual ruler or his immediate ancestors draw heavily on the Narashamsi and Danastuti hymns of the still earlier Vedic corpus. Similarly, the historical biographies have their debt to the tradition of biographical elements in the Itihasa Purana literature. Professor Thapar makes an interesting observation that the Mahabharata is a compilation of biographical fragments written by a grandfather on his sons and grandsons. The dynastic chronicles have their debt to Vamshanucharitas, forming part of the Puranas. This does not mean that here is a seamless continuation of the tradition. Where do we find the differences? First, there is greater verifiability in the matter of the externalized forms. The Vamshanucharita sections of the Puranas speak about kings whose names do occur in other sources, but there is a major difference. In the case of the dynastic chronicles and historical biographies or inscriptional prashastis, these are not in the form of those who would rule in the Kali Yuga at some distant future. The tense used is extremely important. The use of past tense in the genre coming up in the early medieval period makes it clear that it is about the past. This may sound like tautology, but it is not so. The use of the future tense in the Puranic Vamshanucharitas indicates that their purpose, at least a primary, is not about documenting the past. Hence, in what Professor Thapar calls Vamshavalis, used as shorthand for dynastic chronicles, that is not the case. A past, more real and less fantasized, comes to the fore. It is almost tactile. The reader, ever since the composition of these works, was sure that there were individuals called Harsha or Vikramaditya or Ishanavarman or Ramapala or Jayapida. But how many could have imagined before the indological researches of the last couple of centuries that the names in the Puranic king lists are more than fancy? Secondly, this genre is more confident about chronology. The individuals and events mentioned in the Vamshavalis are dated in worldly eras, the Shaka era or the Vikrama era or Kali era or the other countless eras, but all the same with definite anchoring in chronology. In some other cases, it is the regnal years of the rulers which their audience would have known definitely and which we can calculate. Characters and events in the Vamshanucharitas used to float about weightlessly in an air of fancy. Their counterparts in the Vamshavalis can now be pinned down to points in chronotopos, which is what makes the latter clearly externalized history. While the kings of the Vamshanucharitas could have ruled anywhere, Harsha is from Sthanvishwara, Pulakeshin is from Vatapi, and Nandivarman is from Kanchipuram. They are also ruling during dates mentioned. This is a clear difference. A third aspect about the externalized forms is related to their authorship. while the Vamshanucharita sections form part of the Puranas, which are not stated as the work of an individual author. In fact, all of them are latched onto the ubiquitous Vyasa. The Vamshavalis are of known authors. In fact, the authors such as Bana or Sandhyakaranandin or Bilhana or Atula or Kalhana signed their names almost with a vengeance, and also make it a point to say, to the point of being boastful, details about themselves. Even in the case of inscriptions, the more ornate ones are signed by the poets who composed them. Thus we have the names of Harishena, Ravikirti and many other poets signing their names as authors of inscriptions. This goes beyond megalomaniac show-off. It is a claim to authenticity. To be authentic means to be acceptable. This definitive and exhaustive treatment of the subject, it is another matter that Professor Thapar herself thinks that she has only scratched the surface. Now that is what she claims. If it takes 750 pages to scratch the surface, you can imagine what it is to go deeper. A treatment of the subject allows one to look into similar patterns in other parts of the subcontinent. The subtitle of the book is significant: Historical Traditions of Early North India. Professor Thapar makes no claim that she is writing on India as a whole, but the validity of her findings to other parts of the country is unquestioned. As one who is a little more at home with sources from South India, I shall point out some of these. Mushika Vamshakavya, a dynastic chronicle from the extreme south, from what was a chiefship under the hegemony of the Chera kingdom of Kerala in the 11th century, is interesting. It participates in all features of the Itihasa Purana tradition in the early chapters, with Parashurama as responsible for anointing the first ruler of the dynasty. The first 10 chapters are typically in the Mahakavya mode, with royal hunts, water sports, and what have you. But as we come to the 11th chapter onwards, the historicity of events and individuals are clear. I shall take up two of these. One of them brings out the complexity of political alliances and relations in South India in the 9th century. Jayaraga, the Chera king, was married to a Mushika princess, sister of Ishanavarman, the Mushika king. Ishanavarman married a Chedi princess, Nandini, and helped his Chedi father-in-law to recapture his territory. This provoked the Cheras, who marched against the Mushikas and forced the latter to submission. A happy ending is brought about with the marriage of Ishanavarman, the Mushika king, to a Chora princess. The episode begins to make sense when we place it against the political history of the period. This was when the Choras and the Rashtrakutas were engaged in a bid for mastery over South India, as it were. Every other power, big and small, was required to define its position in the two rival camps. The Chedis were on the Rashtrakuta side and the Cheras on the Chora side. When the Mushakas, a subordinate of the Cheras, married into the Chora family, that was not taken kindly by the Cheras, who were loyal to the Choras. Hence they forced the Mushikas to submit, and the sequel to it was the Mushaka marrying the Chora princess. At another level, there is an ingenious way in which the system of inheritance in the Mushika dynasty is defended. The earlier chapters dealing with the names of rulers that cannot be verified from other sources assume that they followed patrilineal. But from the time of Ishanavarman, who we met just now, it is matrilineal. The Kavya presents a story of a shift from patrilineal to matrilineal in the succession in that house, which was following a boon of goddess Kali to the Chora princess that Ishanavarman had married and subsequently neglected. Historians in the past have explained it as resulting from the conquest of the Mushika territory by the Cheras of Kerala, who followed the matrilineal system. What is more likely is that the Sanskrit poet explained what to him and his audience would look like an aberrant phenomenon, matrilineal in a Kshatriya house, by means of a mythical incident placed in the twilight of the remote and the recent pasts. In any case, what is important here is that the fact of matrilineal being the system of inheritance in that house in the historical period does not stop the court poet from singing praise of ancestors of the patron and preparing elaborate genealogies. The insights of Professor Thapar, insights that Professor Thapar provides are useful not just about the Vamshavalis. Her analysis of inscriptions is a template within which similar exercises could be done in the context of peninsular India. Her statement that not only the authorship but also the intent are different between the votive inscriptions at the Buddhist sites and the inscriptions of the early medieval period is valid about the Deep South as well. The large number of Tamil Brahmi cave labels of the early centuries of our era and the copper plates and stone inscriptions of the period of the Pallavas and Cholas bear no comparison with one another. While history is embedded in the former, it is externalized in the latter. In fact, historians reconstructed much of the dynastic and diplomatic history of this period on the basis of the prashastis in these inscriptions. The exercise of Professor Thapar in relation to the Chandelas of Jayajaka Bhakti can be repeated in relation to any dynasty in South India as well. One or two interesting questions that these inscriptions throw up will be mentioned here. We have questions of succession which occur almost in every dynasty. Nandivarman Pallava Malla in the Pallava dynasty is described by historians to have been elected to the throne. When his predecessor Parameshwaravarman died without issues, a member of a collateral line removed by seven generations from the main line was anointed king. The events leading to and through this are depicted on the walls of the Vaikuntha Perumal temple in Kanchipuram, a veritable prashasti in sculpture. But Nandivarman's own prashastis have a different story to tell. In half a dozen of them, Nandivarman is mentioned as coming after Parameshwaravarman, Anantaram. In one of them, he is Parameshwaravarman's son, Sunu. It is only in one record that there is a reference to a collateral line. And when we come to the prashastis of the later rulers, it is as if nothing abnormal had happened. What does this indicate? There is something more about the inscriptions of South India. We have a large number of records of local bodies which too have historical agenda. Thus, when the provisions for the conduct of the Sabha are amended in one of the two famous inscriptions at Uttaramerur, it does make a reference to an earlier inscription. Did the authority issuing the record, the second order, consult the record mentioned in situ, or was a copy of it available in the royal secretariat? With the weighty evidence of record keeping in the Chola state, the latter is probable. So also we have elaborate records of trading organizations. Some of these, like the Ayavole, maintained their own elaborate prashastis with their myths of origin, but also with details of their mundane activities. Sthala Mahatmyas abound in South India, but even here there is historical tradition. For instance, the Koyilozhugu, concerned with the past of the Sri Langam temple, although participating in the mythological in the earlier sections, is down to earth history in its later portions. History is not just for those who sat on the throne, it is also for those others who had power and influence in society. There are many other areas which are illumined by these studies. Visual representation of the past is among them. Professor Thapar has fleetingly mentioned, and in fact Professor Roy was saying that there is scope for taking it up in greater detail. Professor Thapar has fleetingly mentioned the Buddhist panels and the Ashoka sculpture at Kanganahalli. The sculptured panel in Vaikuntha Perumal temple I mentioned above is a more elaborate and expressive case in point. How far have we looked at the Chola frescoes in the Brihadishwara temple, with Rajaraja and his preceptor Karuvur Thevar as expressions of a historical consciousness? It will not be possible to exhaust the possibilities that the book opens up. It is not the just the past before us, earlier than us, but it is the past in front of us, past before us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Najaf?
As someone who works in a different stream of Indian history and with different sources, the book comes to me as both as a challenge and influence. There is a section in the book which is a suggestion and an argument that there was a continuity between early Indian historical traditions and traditions of history writing in medieval India. And this statement is not an aside, it's made deliberately with conviction. And even though the argument is left subtly unexplored, it is sufficient to provoke response. And there is this response that I am presenting before you. While making this statement, Professor Thapar is taking on a long-standing line of argument in medieval Indian historiography that Indo-Persian historical writings are heir to a different tradition, a tradition which goes back to Arabic Islamic history writing, which borrowed elements from Syriac chronicles, particularly annalistic tradition, and also imperial or courtly historical traditions from Iran. And through cross-fertilization came to India when the Turks established the Delhi Sultanate and reached a high point under the Mughals. Therefore, the argument was that it developed in isolation. It was part of a larger argument that medieval Indian history constitutes some kind of a break with the past, with a whole range of new institutions, tools of governance, a new ruling class, ethnically different ruling class. I'm using the term ethnic in a very broad sense. Turks, Afghans, Mughals, new religion, Islam, and a new language of administration and high culture, Persian. And therefore, it's difficult to make a statement that Kalhan's Rajatarangini, for instance, had any influence over history writing in medieval India. It is this particular view that Professor Thapar is challenging in this book, and I think it's very important that we look at it closely. The first reaction which came from me is that the argument is true to a very large extent if we considered a corpus of literature in medieval India which we might broadly classify as Indic. You can clearly see that there are inscriptions, and Professor Thapar has cited the evidence of the Palambali inscription and other later inscriptions. There are treatises written in Prakrit or Prakrit-laced Apabhramsh, such as Thakura Pheru's treatises on gemology, on metrology, on mathematics. He was a 14th century Khalji official from Delhi. And he writes in a tradition which does not to me appear to be Perso-Islamic. He calls Alauddin Ashwapati Mahanarendra, a title which you will not find in any other book written on Alauddin Khilji. There are Charitas biographies of kings and nobles, biography of Jahangir, biography of Man Singh, Mancharita, of Amrit Rao, biography of noble and chieftain of Bundi, Surjan Charita, Ajit Vilas. There are so many biographies of people of eminence. And of course, there are bardic traditions, of which Nancy's Khayat is a very good example, which combines in itself both the tradition of Vanshavali and bardic narration. So it's a case to argue that there is a long drawn tradition which survives all these newly established institutions and regimes and flourishes. Much more challenging, however, is to extend this argument to Persian language writings in India, because it is generally believed that books of history were written as books of history for the first time in the 13th century, with the title Tarikh, with a particular structure, and with a philosophy of history. That's why it's sometimes difficult to call them chronicles, although they were chronicles. And that these books were unique. Therefore, it's very important to test this particular line of argument and subject this material also to a comparative analysis and see how much of this is drawn from pre-existing traditions, from contemporary traditions of Indic historical literature or other literary compositions, to see where are the interstices between the two. This is something which has not been done, and I think this books and the weight of this book and the weight of Professor Thapar's scholarship really demands that there should be a rethinking of this kind of argument where historical traditions are seen in isolation. It's possible to argue that in the beginning, perhaps in the 13th century, that may not have been the case, that people who came from outside with new traditions were not able to expand, interact in a way people after 150 years or 200 years started. So as time progressed, simple common sense approach tells us that there were interactions between the two traditions, the so-called Indic tradition and Perso-Islamic tradition. And there are ways in which you can sense this, although, as I said, there is no research. When we read, at least from the 15th century, romances in Hindi, in the local dialect of Hindi written in the Persian script, such as Dawood's Chandayan or Padmavat of Malik Muhammad Jaisi or Mrigavati, and other compositions. And then comes a moment when the two scholars or two scholarly traditions are brought together in what is popularly known as Akbar's translation movement, in which books written in Sanskrit are translated and made available to people who could read them and understand their content and the manner in which the content is organized and the underlying philosophy of the book. And there were other moments in the 17th century when similar projects were undertaken. So it's possible to argue that there were occasions where the two traditions came together and opportunities were provided for greater intercultural communication. And therefore, there is a case here to argue too that one should look at least not in its form, in its explicit form, but one should look inside the text of registers, of moments where ideas were translated and amalgamated in the structure of the narrative as something which is difficult to recognize. And when I see how Professor Thapar has tried to retrieve the various aspects of historical consciousness, historical tradition, and finally historical writing from widely dispersed and difficult sources which do not easily lend themselves to historical extraction of historical consciousness or tradition, then it's quite possible for people who are working with sources which I can call, using Professor Thapar's or extending her language, fully externalized genres of writing, where history is there, that you can enter and see different registers. Finally, it's very important to understand that there came a time in the tradition of Indo-Persian history writing when scholars began to think and write about the history of pre-Islamic India. And that was a moment where this particular concern of reading about India's ancient past with sources which did not come from the Perso-Islamic tradition became very, very important. And there are works where India's ancient past is written about, where sources are cited, such as Mahabharata or other sources, beginning with Abul Fazl's chapter on India called Ahwal-e Hindustan, Firishta's, Qasim Firishta's excellent chapter on the ancient history of India, Tahir Sabzwari's long, running into hundreds of pages in manuscript of India's history and philosophy in his Rawzatut Tahirin. What are the sources that they are reading? And if they are reading those sources which have carried influence from early India, then what is the influence other than a simple understanding of the subject? So there is a very, very good reason to begin thinking about this and look at the continuity of argument much more closely than the argument of break and isolation. Finally, I would like to say that Professor Thapar has also done a marvelous job of drawing the attention of medieval Indian historians to look at genres other than formal histories. And there is so much of literature which can be used to read history, at least try to read history in a manner in which Professor Thapar has done. Biographies, autobiographies come for the first time in a very big way. They are not only in Persian but also in Hindi. And the sense of history which these autobiographies contain is something which we haven't really been looking. We are mostly interested in the historical information which they carry or the idea of self-reflection. But we haven't really looked closely at the notion of histories which these autobiographies and biographies carry. And there are biographies and autobiographies written by all kinds of people. Humayun's personal valet has written his autobiography. A small merchant, Banarsi Das, has written his versified autobiography. And of course, Jahangir and Babar's autobiographies are known. So we have a whole range of autobiographies where, if we approach them with questions such as those which Professor Thapar has posed before her sources, I'm sure there are going to be a new understanding of historical consciousness in these autobiographies. The last point which I would like to make is that beyond these concerns, beyond concerns of form and techniques of history writing, for which also we practically have to start a new project of looking at the relationship between oral tradition and written tradition in medieval Indian historiography, which we haven't really done, at least not enough. There was a strong oral tradition in medieval Islamic history writing, and writing on paper after the 9th century became very, people would like to remember things rather than write them down, and there was a certain stigma attached to writing. The famous Islamic scholar Imam Ghazali, who was traveling in a caravan when his caravan was intercepted by a band of robbers, and when he pleaded that they could take everything but his books, the answer which he got was, what kind of knowledge you have which will go with your books? You should have it in here. Now that incident may not be true, but it's symptomatic of a culture where orality was more important than written documentation. Even if we are thinking that Perso-Islamic traditions of history writing came to India and went through successive stages of changes and transformation, we'll have to look closely at this question of orality. But beyond these concerns, there are themes such as purpose and philosophy of history writing. And Professor Thapar particularly singles out legitimation of authority, political, religious authority, sometimes poetic, literary authority, question of identity. I think these two themes are very important and predominant in history writing in medieval India, even in the Indo-Persian tradition. And I can give you an example. A 14th century history written in Delhi by somebody who was born and brought up in a town not very far from Delhi, and who had not come from outside as early historian, who was Indian in that sense. When he writes his history of the Delhi Sultanate from Balban to early Firoz Tughlaq's reign, it's not a simple account of dynasties and kings. It's a selective account. It's an account in which the past is recollected to argue the case of an ideal state in society. An ideal state which guarantees political stability, and an ideal society which is hierarchical. And all this unfolds in a larger Islamic framework. So much so that people would perhaps like to argue that Ziauddin Barni took his understanding or argument of hierarchy from the Indian caste system, because Islam does not have any notion of hierarchy. However, Islam had by then internalized notions of hierarchy so much so that it became part of an Islamic tradition just as well. Now, his philosophy of history has this strong element of legitimation of a particular ideal state, which is not based on idea, but it's based on history. There was a state which is no more an, if you want to establish political stability or an ideal society, then you should allow those elements to come back and establish themselves. So it's not an ideal Islamic society, it's a historical society. It's a society which was there in history. It was a state which was there in history, and it needs to be reestablished. So there is, here you have a finely written history of the Delhi Sultanate where there is a particular purpose, and that purpose is based on legitimation of a particular kind of society and state, and of course the notion of identity of a superior high-born Muslim class. So even if you transcend formal forms and techniques, you have certain themes which would allow a good comparative study of the two traditions, sometimes with the excuse that ideas, similar ideas, can grow in isolation and are worthy of comparison. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Najaf. We had actually a set of fantastic presentations. To begin with, Professor Thapar, in her very brief introductory remarks, showed us how the main concerns of such a complex 700-page volume can actually be outlined in with astounding lucidity and astounding brevity. And after that, Kumkum and Kesavan told us about the two major kinds of forms that Professor Thapar is actually concerned with in the book. The first she calls embedded histories, and the second she calls externalized or embodied histories. And then Najaf extended the discussion by speaking about medieval historiography and the Persian tradition of historiography and the kind of connections that could be established between what the book speaks about and what the book looks forward to beyond its covers. Now, I am actually not a professional historian. In fact, I am here as a representative of the non-professional, non-historian, you could say. But I have a kind of remote interest which connects me with this book, which I tremendously enjoyed doing a preliminary reading of. I am interested in what one could call a critical history of that form of thought which we call literature. And it has, of course, subterranean connections with the larger social imaginaries and the larger historical imaginaries. I was particularly interested in Professor Thapar's concern with genres of writing which we do not normally associate with explicit historiographical writing. Like both Kesavan as well as Kumkum spoke extensively about them, you have the Kavya, you have the Puranas, you have the biographies, you have the Vamshavalis, genres which are actually not self-consciously explaining historical events. My own interest actually comes from the little work I did on a set of autobiographical writings which were not really telling the story of one's personal life as the main theme, but using one's personal life as a kind of pretext, telling us something about the social and historical changes of the times through which one lived. And this is a kind of historical writing. But of course, it's not professional historiography. I was interested in the kind of gap between what a professional historian is able to say about that period and what a non-professional genre is able to sometimes not say, but show, visibilize in some way without necessarily explaining in a rational discourse. And Professor Thapar's rich discussion of embedded histories especially, and also some parts of the embodied histories like the biographical tradition, the Charitas, for example, are precisely of this kind where you are actually dealing with genres which are not self-consciously setting out to provide rational explanation of past events. Now, what I hope to add in 2 or 3 minutes is just to add 3 very brief footnotes to the expert discussions which have happened so far. And these are more by way of questions, and these questions are not really Professor Thapar's book's questions, but these are the questions which somebody like me who comes from outside the discipline receives from a book like this, receives from the generosity of a book like this. The first question which actually the book provokes in my mind is about the nature of this relationship between the various genres, like the embedded histories, the embodied histories, and modern historical writing. Now, we know, like Kumkum already said, that we shouldn't take this distinction as some kind of watertight compartments, but rather we should see them as intersecting categories. That she was kind of suggesting that sometimes in the same text you may have these different modalities coexisting. Be that as it may, but it's a fact that in our own times we have not only professional historical writing, but also forms of embedded histories. Histories which are actually not really in the professional domain, but which probably get articulated in the form of biographies or poems or whatever they are. The question which Professor Thapar's discussion provokes in my mind is, what kind of function are they fulfilling? That is, the larger question, the deeper question I'm concerned with is, what is it to have a past? Of course, we think about societies as having a past. We know as individuals that we inhabit, we assume a past by various kinds of remembering. Some of them are narrative forms of remembering, by which we implicitly or explicitly write our autobiographies, sometimes as coherent texts, sometimes as fragments, anecdotes, etc. But we also assume past by rituals of practices of commemoration, celebration, and sometimes inarticulate incorporation of traumatic events, the kind of stuff which Freud was concerned about when he spoke about melancholia rather than mourning. So there are different ways in which we actually hold a past in our existence. And similarly, I believe that societies may also have varieties of ways in which they assume a past. They come to have a past, they come to be conscious about a past or aware of a past. And I wondered what this non-explicit form of historical writing, where historicality is actually embedded in other forms, what kind of functions they would be doing in these various cultures, in ancient times as well as in our own times. Now, this leads me to the second related question. Professor Thapar has, I was particularly struck by her reading of literary texts, which, Mudra Rakshasam, for example, incredibly detailed reading of Mudra Rakshasam. Now, as Najaf already pointed out, Professor Thapar looks at these historical writings in terms of the author who wrote it, the audience to whom it was meant, and also what she broadly calls the agenda, the intention. What is the intention in the present of writing of this kind of historical writing? Now, the question of intention, it is possible for us to pose about what we can translate as some kind of narrativized historical content. Like in the case of Mudra Rakshasam, Professor Thapar connects it to certain valorization of the idea of loyalty, for instance. And she has a very interesting historical placement of the discourse on loyalty. What interests me as a student of literature is actually the particular form that this concern takes. Now, that is, of course, a concern of embedded histories in general. Why is it that there is a particular presentation of the Rakshasa? Why is it that certain terrifying images are invoked and they take this particular kind of form? What is actually the function of one particular idiom of fantasy as distinct from another? Now, these are not really a writer's private fantasies, as we know. These are part of a larger social imaginary. Obviously, they communicate, they produce some effect in the people who receive them. So this social imaginary, of course, is also part of the story of that space within which historical writing takes place, in its embedded form and in its more detached forms. So one of the questions which Professor Thapar's wonderful discussion of literature provoked in my mind is actually to think about a history of forms of embedding, forms that embed, the particular idioms that embed and receive these kernels of historicality. And the last point is about the most enjoyable moments in reading Professor Thapar's book were these incredible intermittent meditations on the idea of time. It comes up like a kind of meditative interlude in the book at several points in time. And she picks up the concerns, she presents ones, returns to them with the regularity, with the difference of a kind of cyclical narrative. The narrative returns to this point about time. And central to that discussion about time is, of course, the distinction between cyclical temporality and linear temporality. And Professor Thapar is not interested in a binaristic opposition between them. She is interested in how they actually work, what kind of consequences would they have. Like, for example, temporal imagination of immense magnitudes. They often do not have any consequence for the lived lifespan of human beings, not to speak about everyday lives or the rememberable past that people are often concerned about. Just like a very large circle at any point, any extent which you can actually contemplate, would look exactly like a straight line. So the cycle and the line may actually coincide if you expand the circumference of the cycle to infinity. Yeah? But I am interested in another question. Like, similar questions have come up in relation to other ancient cultures, like Greek society, for example, and the kind of narrative imagination it generated. An eminent philosopher, once commenting on Greek tragedy, made a distinction between the Aeschylus' tragedies, the Orestia, for example, which works with a kind of cyclical structure. You have a transgression, then you have a nemesis, then this nemesis actually takes the form of another transgression, which invites a further nemesis. And eventually the cycle gets reconciled with a moment of reconciliation between the old order of gods and the new order of gods at the end of the Orestia. Now, here you have a kind of cycle. So each segment is like an arc. Each part of the trilogy called Orestia is actually an arc of this moral cycle of transgression and retribution and further transgression. When you move to something like Sophoclean tragedy, like Oedipus, you do not have any cycle there. You have it's a straight line of wandering, because the initial act itself, without any knowledge of it, has already crossed a line, and after that you only have this possibility of its revelation. You're piecing together of evidence and the ultimate condemnation and the wandering out of the city. Now, what I'm interested in is not in the validity of these particular readings, but the way in which this philosopher seeks to establish a connection between the experience of time and the experience of a kind of moral universe that a person inhabits. That is, to experience time is not a kind of cognitive act. It is also to adopt a horizon or to assume a horizon within which your life events tend to have some meaning. So there is some kind of relationship between the question of significance and the experience of the model of time. Now, this is, of course, related not only to the empirical experience of seasons and other cyclical experience of our relationship with the cosmos, but it's also related to the question of death, the question of trauma, the question of forgetting, things of that kind. So I was interested, again, not as a professional, this may not be a professional historian's question, but as a student of literature, I was interested in the kind of moral imaginaries that these different orders of time place before people of ancient India and medieval India. So these are the three short comments which I wanted to offer to the rich discussion that the historians have presented before us. Now, can we take 10 minutes more, Mr. Mukherjee? So could we have some responses from the audience, and then I will let the panelists speak once more, very briefly, in response to the questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Thapar, for the book. But I'm just, well, I guess there is no point in my responding as somebody who's a scholar of archaeology, because archaeology makes all this very simple in terms of not looking at questions of intention, despite the fact that archaeologists actually deal with material culture, and they should be doing it. And I think Professor Veluthat said third-rate books about the Herodotus. Some of our archaeology books begin with the fact that India had no sense of history, and it is, therefore, archaeology is an important discipline by its own rights, because it corroborates historical evidence. But what I'm struck about with this book, and having read the book loads of times, in fact, since I bought it in September, is the idea of what it does to perhaps lay readers like me, is to actually break the notion of professionalization of history. I mean, we are all talking in terms of as a historian, not as a historian, or professional history, not professional history, because the whole historiography which Professor Thapar addresses is the historiography of history itself. So it is from the 18th century when people started thinking about how history is to be written, which in relation to, of course, the Oriental and the colonial historiography, came up with the idea, and it wasn't only India, but many of the colonized states did not have a sense of history, because whoever were the colonizing powers were going to give the others a sense of history. So that gets broken. But what's interesting, as I said, what Professor Roy brought up was the whole idea of visual histories, because here we do find historians, art historians especially, of India, and those who have been dealing with, say, Mughal manuscripts and things like that, have actually been talking about these things without enunciating any of these points, showing how traditions got embedded, showing how traditions got externalized in the paintings. And if we pick up on the visual histories, and that's something which I work on, I think there is huge possibilities which all her points, I don't know whether there's 7 or there are hundreds, which I would pick up from them, would actually illuminate on. And that is something historians sometimes fail to consider. And visual histories are mostly thought in terms of fashion. So I remember when I picked up working on photographs, it was considered fashionable to do so, but it's not, because the way we engage with the world is through analogy. We never actually look at the way we interrogate the analogy. So visual history has a huge impetus. And of course, your bridge between the so-called early and medieval and the thrust, I think, which you've given to every student of history, and not only South Asian history, in terms of thinking about historicism, why we engage with this whole practice ourselves. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I would like to beg pardon, because I would like to speak in English rather than English. I'm student of comparative studies in history, and so to say, at certain points I may not agree whatever been said. Sorry for that. सर मेरा मानना है एक इतिहास कभी भी किसी कोरे पन्ने पर नहीं लिखा जाता, या कोरी कैनवस पर इसकी पेंटिंग नहीं होती, किसी पेंटिंग को मिटाकर उसके ऊपर दूसरी पेंटिंग लिखी जाती है। इसलिए जो पन्ने होते हैं वो कोरे नहीं, धरती कोरी नहीं होती, वहाँ लोग होते हैं, उनका कल्चर होता है, उनकी हिस्ट्री होता है, ट्रेडिशन होती है, म्यूजिक होता है, डांस होता है, सब कुछ होता है, जो भी चलता जाता है। मैंने वर्ड हिस्ट्री पढ़ी है, छोटे छोटे एग्जाम्पल दूंगा। अब सॉरी, आई वांट टू ब्रीफ। तो जो हम इतिहास की, मैम ने एंशिएंट हिस्ट्री वेदा की तरफ चले गए, सर साउथ में चले गए, उन्होंने इस्लामिक हिस्ट्री की बातें, मैडम ने कुछ और एनालिसिस किया। इट्स ऑल ट्रू, बट व्हाट आई एम टू से ये जब लोगों ने जो हिस्ट्री बनाई, जिन्होंने हिस्ट्री बनाई, तो दिस इज माय पॉइंट। आई हैव टू से लॉट, बट एज यू से देयर इज नो टाइम, आई विल कन्फाइन माई सेल्फ टू फ्यू पॉइंट्स। इंडोनेशिया के इतिहास से लिए सारे ट्राइबल्स थे, हिंदू बनाए, मुसलमानों ने मुसलमान बना दी, एक पेंटर आता है दूसरे कैनवस पर अपनी पेंट करता शुरू चला गया। इसी तरह इंडिया में अभी भी 8% ट्राइबल्स हैं, 100% ट्राइबल्स थे, राइट अप टू तक्षशिला, साउथ फैला हुआ था, अभी ड्रिवन बैक टू नॉर्थ, साउथ डीप साउथ तक दूसरे लोग आए। वेदास जो ट्राइबल्स ने लिखे थे, एरियंस कहते हैं हमारे हैं। तो देयर इज सॉर्ट ऑफ कंट्रोवर्सी इन द हिस्ट्री। कहने का मतलब ये है, इतिहासकार, मैं दुनिया के इतिहासकारों को चैलेंज करता हूं, और मुझे इस बात का दुख है जब भी वो बैठते हैं अपना गीत गाते हैं, अपनी थ्योरीज फॉरवर्ड करते हैं, ये नहीं बताते कि किनके कंधे पर बैठ के ये इतिहास लिखा गया, कौन वो लोग थे जिनको दास बनाया गया। कोई भी इतिहासकार नहीं बनाता कि यहाँ के ट्राइबल से जिन्होंने दास्ता की जीवन बताया, ये दास थे। अफनासी अपने ट्रेवलॉग में लिखता है कि साउथ में वो ट्रेवल कर रहा था तो उसने देखा कि दास बिकते थे, जो पर्शियन लोग सेंट्रल इंडिया में रूल कर रहे थे वो खरीदते थे उनको, जो जंगलों से पकड़ कर लाए जाते थे। सॉरी अहमद सिंह, ये दास लोगों के बारे में कोई नहीं बोलता, उनकी कंट्रीब्यूशन के बारे में कोई। नॉर्थ अमेरिका, साउथ अमेरिका, सेंट्रल अमेरिका, माया, टोल्टेक, एस्टेक, टिंका, क्रोक, जितने भी ट्राइब्स, आई एम स्टूडेंट ऑफ वर्ड ट्राइब्स, मुझे अच्छा सब पता है क्या हुआ उनके साथ, क्या जुल्म हुए उनके साथ। ये सिविलाइज लोगों ने किए जो अपने इतिहास लिख के बैठे हुए हैं। जब भी अपनी बात करते हैं इस्लाम कहाँ से आया, कहाँ था इस्लाम 1400 पहले, कहाँ था हिंदुइज्म कहाँ पहले, ये सब ट्राइबल की देन है, ये उनके कंधे पर इन्होंने अपना इतिहास लिखा, उनकी बात कभी नहीं होती। आई एम सॉरी, ये एक बहुत बड़ी ड्रॉबैक है। थैंक यू,
थैंक यू वेरी मच। एंड anybody else wants to say anything? So can we have would you like? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's yes. So Romila, would you, Najaf, would you like to say anything? Yeah, so Romila, would you like to say a few words
in a hurry? Well, let me begin by saying that I'm absolutely delighted with the reaction of the three panelists, the four, in fact, because it strengthens certain ideas that I've been playing around with, which I've been playing around with for a long time, and which, in a sense, became part of the book. And I'm very pleased that some of these ideas have found ground and found the possibility of potential development. I must confess that I was very concerned when I put this book, when I gave it to the publisher and had it published, that there might be some criticism of the fact that I was taking history too lightly and sort of dismissing it as consciousness and tradition and writing and so on. But I'm glad that the issue of the differences of nuances in the way one looks at history are differences that have come up so extremely well. Thank you very much indeed. That's been extremely helpful to me. Kumkum, I liked your suggestion of further work on the dialogue between Brahmanism and Buddhism, because I think this is something that we desperately need to work on, which we have ignored. And it's precisely, I think, in areas like this, where it's not clearly a religious dogma, but it's a general area of literature, of humanism, or whatever it is, that really that dialogue shows up very much. And also, indeed, looking at the visual material, as Sudeshna also pointed out, unfortunately, one can't do everything in one book. But I was very aware of the fact that there is a very strong tradition in visual material which needs to be looked at, because it's not just a question of putting together iconic forms, but it's also a question of looking at the aesthetics and trying to see where the aesthetics have come from, because the creation of the aesthetic is in itself a historical process, and I think that's extremely important in any kind of visual discussion. I'm very, very pleased that that Kesavan, you touched on sources from South India, and that you think that some of what I've said is relevant to South Indian history. I thought so too, but I didn't dare say so because I'm not as familiar with South Indian sources. But I think that what my intention was, really, one of my unspoken intentions in the book, is for people to take it and say, does it apply to my region and my area and my field of investigation? If it applies, well and good. If it doesn't, too bad. How much of it applies? It doesn't need to be to apply totally, but a certain percentage could apply. And I think that will come up, as you rightly said, Kesavan, that once one starts looking at history from below and looking at histories other than the histories of royalty, of which we are very fortunate, because as the chronology advances towards today, there are more and more texts of communities and groups and professions and so on who've maintained some kind of history. And I think that interweaving of that history into the royal tradition and the chronicles of royalty and so on would be a very salutary exercise for historians to carry out. Najaf, I wish you would take on this project and look at these chronicles and tell us about where there are continuities and discontinuities and why, because that is really the important question. Why there are continuities and why there are discontinuities. I wish somebody would do that, because I think it's a terribly important thing to do. We are so used to treating it as a disjuncture that we don't even begin to think of the fact that there was an interface, there was a dialogue. What was this dialogue about? Where did this dialogue take place? And if one argues that the dialogue between the Buddhists and the Brahmins was a sort of quiet dialogue that hasn't been tom-tommed and spoken about in a very public way, one could say the same thing about the dialogues that came afterwards, that we really have to search for them and look for them. And I'm pleased that you thought that there was a possibility in these ideas. And of course, as you rightly said, the oral tradition is absolutely crucial. Not only for our kind of times when it's been overwritten, but you now have techniques where you can analyze oral traditions. One is so impressed with the fact that 20 years ago, if you spoke about oral traditions, people laughed at you and said, how can you possibly, as a historian, talk about oral traditions? Today, there are methods and techniques of analyzing oral traditions which have become so important. And I think that's really... and the question of identity is crucial, because when you have a dialogue going on between communities, how they identify themselves and what pasts they are using to build that identity is really absolutely fundamental. And as I said, I wish, you would do something on that. Uday, your questions were all extremely interesting. The one, of course, that appealed to me most was the one on time, which I have since been thinking about even more. I have somewhere talked about the linear being a segment of the arc. And that's, I don't know whether I've forgotten whether I mention it in this book, but somewhere I have talked about that. And more recently, I've been looking at something else which intrigues me enormously, and that is that if you take the Mahayuga and the 4 yugas in terms of a cycle of time where the cycle doesn't return to the beginning point, it bypasses the beginning point and it forms another cycle. That doesn't return to the beginning, it bypasses, it forms another cycle. And these 4 cycles then form a kind of helix, they form a spiral. And if you take a spiral and you begin to stretch the spiral, you get a very kinky, wavy line, but at some point you might actually get almost a straight line. So I think that this interrelationship between the cyclic and the linear is very, very fundamental, and is something that we really need to look at much more. And even those people who've written about time very extensively, people like Paul Ricoeur and so on, I feel that they haven't looked at the interrelationship. They've looked at it as either linear or as cyclic and kept them separate. But in fact, sometimes I think one should really talk about multiple concepts of time, and then begin to look at how compositions involving chronology are constructed. But thank you very much, all of you. Thank you very much indeed for what has been for me a very enriching experience.
Thank you, Professor Thapar, and thank you, Kumkum, Kesavan, and Najaf, and thank you all for being here.